Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from YarkspiriFantasyArt.com and welcome to another illustration video tutorial. So for this week's tutorial, the request was that I actually draw a cyborg steampunk character. So first of all, I love mechanical objects and mechanical robots and stuff like that, so this was a lot of fun to work on. Before I started on this piece, obviously the first thing I did is I did some research about some steampunk costumes to get a general idea of how I was going to actually approach this design. Now, when I started on this piece, I pretty much had a general idea of what camera angle I was going to use. So essentially, working image towards that camera angle was probably the most difficult portion. So what I ended up doing is, obviously I looked at some reference material to get some ideas, but I actually ended up drawing a more flat version, and as you saw, I actually skewed it essentially into the correct perspective. Once I had that framework to work on, I then modified the perspective a little bit on the character to make it more readable for the character, because the main focus is the character. So essentially I went in this knowing that I was probably going to have to modify the perspective a little bit, just to make sure that the focus remains on the character itself. Because although I wanted a dynamic angle, I did not want to take away from the character. If the angle is too dynamic, essentially what can happen is that you lose the focus on the character, and instead it becomes a focus on the overall layout rather than the character itself. So for this reason, I skewed it slightly while still keeping a very dynamic angle while working on the background elements. Now, for the majority of this image, I actually used the soft round brush. So the nice thing about the soft round brush is when I'm doing something so detailed like this, having harsh lines, especially when it's a close-up image, is generally not a good idea to have it. So essentially all I did was reduce the size of the brush to a fairly small size once I had the basic information in place. So to get the basic information in place, I used the flat brush that I had created a couple weeks ago to get a general idea of the elements that I was going to use. I then softened all those elements out with the default round brush, and then began adding more of that information in there. So by doing this, I didn't have too much information. I also knew which areas I was going to concentrate on the most when I began detailing it out. So because I did need to have a lot of information on that face to essentially show the mechanics of the face, since it still needed to remain humanoid, because it was a cyborg, I had to zoom in just to make sure I could show enough information in there. Now also, because this is a cyborg, and I want the focus to be essentially on his face, I do have to add more information to help draw people's attention towards the face. It's the portion that people will be looking at the most, and for this reason it needs the most information in order to keep essentially the viewer looking at the face or the eye leading back to that area. So this entire drawing took about 7 hours to complete, so it wasn't too short, but it also wasn't too long of an image, especially considering the amount of detail work that was required for this, and it was a lot of fun to do. I looked at a lot of different clothing references. Some of it actually did include some goth. I also looked at quite a bit of Victorian dresses to get a general idea of some of the design elements that I wanted to include. Now, I wanted to have this character have almost a military look to him. So although he has a military look, he's not too concerned about essentially having every collar perfectly in place. So there is a sense of essentially relaxedness to this character, even though he has some military inspired uniform. Once again, I'm going back to the face, making sure I have enough information. And now I'm just adding information into the arm. So essentially I need to tie in the same type of elements into his arm mechanics as what I had in his facial mechanics. So this is very important. It helps tie in the whole character as a whole, and keep everything so that it looks like it actually belongs together. Now, when I'm working on mechanics, especially for arms, I am taking into account general areas that will have to turn. Now, although I'm taking that into account, though, I'm not allowing this to limit my design approach either. So even though it just needs to essentially look like it can move, possibly. And once you have that, then you're normally fine with the rest of the information because it'll look like it's possible. Working on some of the pant elements. And essentially, he has essentially interfolded clothing elements, which tend to make it more interesting for this character. Now, part of his face is human, because he is a cyborg. Only a portion of him has become part of the mechanics, but because of the angle that I went with for his face, you actually don't see the human side elements to that face. Now, it is slightly insinuated with his other arm, however, because his other arm is clearly human, has not been modified or tweaked in any way. So there is a part of him that is clearly shown as being human, and then another portion is mechanical, at least in this period of time in his life. So I wanted it to look almost like he had essentially received a serious injury. Maybe there was an explosion and essentially part of his body was lost, but they were able to salvage the rest of it. So I need to show all that elements to help tie in everything together. So I'm just working on the arm right now. Now you will see me modify the pipe, especially in the finalized image. You won't actually see me paint that in. The last portion of this video was actually not recorded, so unfortunately you won't see that. But you will see in the final image at the end of this video that I've added quite a few different colors to this image to help draw your eye once again to very specific elements of the piece. Once again, the face is the main focus, so I do have to add a tiny bit more information, especially in certain key areas. But the face is almost completed at this point. Just refining some of the information, really trying to show some of that detail work in his collar, and just refining some of those last minute details in his costume. So you will see me actually work on his hand shortly, and essentially I wanted to have his hand partially gloved, so essentially his hands will have gloves, but the finger portion will be cut off, so it's not completely covering his hand. Working on the background elements right now. And I'm using, for the background elements, I'm actually using the flat brush I had made a while back. This brush is very well suited for background elements because it forces me to keep everything very rough, which is generally what you want to do for background elements. And just working on his hand right now, so I will be adding in the glove shortly. So you will see me make quite a few changes in the pipe, although it's not recorded. In the final image you will see that. It should be coming up shortly. So here's the final image. As you can see, I've added quite a bit of different colors to the image to help finalize the design. And I added a glowing effect to his eye as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.